And welcome to the ADHD Eavesdrop, where you can be a butterfly on the wall and listen in on my conversations. I'm so excited to have JD Barker, a New York Times bestselling author. Today, we're going to have an unscripted conversation about late diagnosis, pattern recognition, creativity, and how neurodivergence has shaped his life and work. I just finished one of his books. It was great, something I keep upstairs. If you guys want to grab that, you'll really enjoy it if you like thrillers. Hi, JD. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I always start out with my guests who have ADHD or autism or both, which you have. I like to hear the story of the before, what led to the later diagnosis, and the after. Can you give me that for our startup?
Yeah, so we got to hit the time machine to go back to the beginning. But I was born in the 70s. So back in the 70s, they didn't look for this sort of thing. So I was essentially the weird kid in the corner that didn't talk to anybody. I didn't necessarily want to play with anyone. I learned how to read at a very early age. I started reading around 3. So by the time I got into kindergarten, I had read like all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews and moved on to Charles Dickens and some of the classics and stuff. So I was a lot more comfortable buried in a book than I was dealing with other people, and teachers, back then they didn't encourage, anything like they were just glad that, they got through the whole school day and nobody died. Like they didn't, try to force you. It's just, it was such a different world. But, I kind of went through life with that. I had no idea that I was on the spectrum in any way whatsoever. I went through, finished up high school, went off to college. I got a couple of degrees and I was working in the corporate world. I've always been good with anything that has a pattern to it. So like playing music, reading music, computer code, writing computer code, that kind of thing. I was working for a brokerage firm and, working in the financial industry in their compliance department. And I basically started writing software to deal with the financial industry. So I had to look at every transaction that passed through this particular firm and compare it to every rule and regulation that existed in the industry. And when I took over that position, it was done by this guy who had actually been doing that by hand. Like he actually knew all these rules and regulations, and like he just went line item by line item. I think our manual at the time for compliance was like 93 pages long when I first started. And by the time I left that job, it was 1,200 pages because there's been so many industry regulations. But it got to the point where a computer just had to do it. So I started writing software for it. I was very good at like that portion of the job, dealing with the data. But when I actually found a problem, then I had to come out of my office and I had to actually talk to somebody about it. And that was already a confrontational situation because I had to go to a manager, I had to go to a broker, and I say, hey, you did this, and you're not allowed to do this, or it looks like you may have done this and you're not supposed to. That immediately puts people on the defensive. So my boss, to his credit, he recognized that I was very good at one portion of the job, but not very good at the people side. He thought I had anger management issues. So he sent me off to an anger management therapist. And we sat down for our initial meeting and we got about 20 minutes into it. And she stopped and she's like, I'm going to ask you a weird question. Have you ever been tested for autism? And at the time, I had no idea what that really was. Like I had seen Rain Man, but that's obviously not a very good representation of it. But she started going into these, different things. She's like, well, the whole time we've been talking, you haven't made eye contact. I noticed that you rub your thumb and your forefinger together whenever you're thinking or formulating a sentence. And she just started rattling off all these things that I do and pointed out that they are all traits, related to autism. So we did some tests and ultimately landed on a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Today's world, you're just on the spectrum somewhere, but they used to have a name for it. And like, once I got that, like any other problem, when you put it in front of me, a problem in front of me, I looked for solutions. So I started to research it. I started to read books. I watched movies, watched documentaries, and, just started to, try and resolve what, I felt was a problem. But to her credit, like she pointed out, there were good and bad points to the whole thing. There were some things that I could do that nobody could do. And there were other things that were problematic. So we kind of made a list of both, and I tackled the problematic stuff, one at a time. We tried to resolve them, and we doubled down on the stuff that I was good at, primarily patterns and things like that. To give you an example, today I'm a best-selling author. I've written a gazillion books. But like you can't see my desk in this video, but there's nothing on it. I plot everything out up here. Like I can see the entire structure of the story in my head. And when I write the first line of that book, I know how what the last line is going to be. And I've got a pretty good handle on everything that's going to fall in between, which is not, very different from writing computer code. If you write that first line of code, you have to understand how it's going to impact the last line of code. So, again, patterns. So yeah, so now I'm 55. I just had a birthday the other day. So it's been 30 some years since I was diagnosed. I'm still dealing with this. It never goes away. But, I'm able to, function and get through life, a fairly quote unquote normal way.
I have done a little bit of research and I know that you do keep everything in your head. And after having read your book, I'm like, how do you keep that all straight in there? And I know that you've credited your autism somewhat in your ability to keep everything straight because there were a lot of names and a lot of plot twists and a lot of things going on in there that would be so hard to keep track of, it seems like, in your head.
Yeah, it comes down to pattern recognition for me. I had mentioned that I had been reading at a very early age. I've never had any formal training in writing, but I read so many books that the structure itself got ingrained in my head. I recognized the pattern of, what I later learned was a 3-act structure. So when I'm writing a book, I understand that a twist needs to happen here, this needs to happen there, this needs to happen. And if I go past one of those points, it's almost like I missed a turn on a road trip going somewhere. Like I can feel that something's wrong and I have to throw the car in reverse and kind of back up and correct. So, it's one of those weird things. Like I've never had any formal training and I'm almost afraid to because like I understand what it takes to actually write a decent book. And like, I'm almost afraid that formal training might screw that up.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I know you talked in one of your interviews that I watched about the fact that you got James Patterson to write a book this way without an outline. Um,
Yeah.
so that's pretty
Yeah. So that
impressive.
yeah, so my second book was coming out. It was called The Fourth Monkey. HarperCollins picked it up, and they do this thing. You've probably seen like on the back of books, they have quotes from big name authors. Greatest book ever by so and so. So when a new book is coming out, they scattershot like all these copies of it to all these big name authors, hoping to get one of those quotes. And one of the guys who happened to get a copy was James Patterson. He read it and he liked the book enough to contact me. And eventually we sat down for lunch and we started discussing the idea of creating a book together or writing something. But we both kind of approached everything from two different camps. I was always what they call a pantser, meaning I pants the novel. I come up with my plot, my characters, I kind of mix it all together and I let the story just sort of flow. He's a notorious outliner, so he creates 30 to 50 pages of every book as an outline before he actually starts to write. So we didn't think we'd be able to work together because it was so different. But he contacted me a little while after we had that meeting. He said, "You know what? Let's go ahead and try it your way. Let's try to pants a novel." So I would write some kind of a chapter, paint him into a crazy, impossible scenario, thinking there's no way he's going to get out of this. I'd send him those pages, and 15 minutes later, he'd send me the next chapter. Not only did he get out of it, but he put me in an even crazier position because he's James Patterson. And we went back and forth like that through the whole novel, and it's by far the twistiest novel I think I've ever worked on.
Which one is that? Is that
That
the one
one's called the Coast to Coast Murders.
I need to check it
Yeah,
out?
and it's funny because if you take a step back and think about it, as somebody with autism, somebody who likes patterns, like an outline makes way more sense to somebody like me than pantsing. And honestly, I've written 6 books with the guy since then, and he's completely converted me. I outline everything at this point. I find it much more efficient than what I was doing before.
And what do you
Yeah.
think that your ADHD and autism does for you in that process?
Well, where it really came in handy is, as somebody who's autistic, when I'm in a social situation, I tend to mimic what I see other people doing. So if somebody cracks a joke around me, I'm going to laugh, but I'm going to laugh because the people around me are laughing. I'm basically just trying to fit in. But I mimic other people. And one of the things that I learned I could do a long time ago is I could mimic people on paper. So if you put something in front of me written by somebody else, I can read it, pick up on their vocabulary, their writing style, their cadence, and their voice, and basically continue that story in their voice. For years, I did about 2 decades where I worked as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, while I was doing the corporate job. I would come home and work on these projects at night, and I would basically write as other people. I wrote a ton of memoirs. So to give you an example, there was a female politician that I did a memoir for. I sat down and interviewed her, but ultimately I had to write a book in first person from her point of view. And I was able to do that. I was able to put myself into her head and write that story. And I think, a lot of that comes from autism. I don't think I'd be able to do that without that particular skill set.
A little bit about my background. I spent 30 years in special education working with students with ADHD and autism. I myself was late diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 50. So you and I grew up in the same era. I'm 56, so we're very close in age. So it's an interesting to hear the challenges that you had to face before and how you've been successful now. And I kind of want to take a little bit of the teacher aspect and say, when you were a kid, I want to go back there. What did the teachers do with you? Because you were a little whiz bomb.
It was a mess from jump. Because when you enter kindergarten, you're already reading. They already have a problem. Like they don't, so I tended to goof off a lot in class because I didn't really have to pay attention. So they bumped me around in grades quite a bit. I didn't really stay in the same classroom for very long. So even when I was in elementary school, they would send me off to like third grade when it came time to read. And I would go to second grade for math. And I would come back to kindergarten to do this. And, it was all over the place. And, this was in Illinois. My dad was a contractor. And when I was 14, he couldn't take the winters up there anymore. So he decided to move us to Florida. And in Florida, the school system is literally behind the Illinois school system by about a year. So, that just made things worse because I was in seventh grade at the time. And, I was a year or 2 years ahead of just the norm, So again, they tried to bounce me around from grade to grade. And, and none of that helps because, I never really had an opportunity to even try to make friends, even if I wanted to, because I kept getting yanked from one place to another. And you're either the, too young kid in the class or you're much older than the kids in the class or it was always a mess.
I'm just sitting here as a teacher and I'm thinking this poor kid.
Changed because I've got a daughter now who's 8 and she was diagnosed as well. And that was very early on, right after she entered kindergarten. So the teachers in today's world, they circle the wagons and they are all over it. And she is getting, exactly the education that she needs. So it's not hindering her in any way whatsoever. So it's a total switch from what I went through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we were kids, first of all, ADHD itself was just considered to be a boys thing if it existed. So I wasn't even looked at for it. And then like autism didn't exist really. So,
No.
And so it really has moved very quickly as far as the development and the change in the educational system. And I started in 92 and I finished in 23. I saw a lot of change. So that's interesting to see that with your daughter as well. So how is she doing in school?
She's doing fantastic. I mean, it's totally different. I mean, they'll pull her aside, like if she has a particular issue that she's having trouble with, they pull her aside, they teach it to her in whatever way she needs. So she gets one-on-one coaching, which is really important. And a lot of times it's, you just have to tweak, what it is, the message you're trying to send, you just change the way you're trying to teach that particular math problem or whatever it is. And she gets it. And once she gets it, she has zero trouble with it, but sometimes she has to hear it a little bit different than the other kids. But the fact that they're able to recognize that, hit the pause button and give her what she needs and keep her going is great.
What do you think the difference would be if you had the kind of education that she had instead of finding out when you were 22 that there was even something there?
I get asked that question a lot. Like I wrote my first book at 43 years old, but I spent 20 some years, working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, so basically working behind the scenes. So people constantly ask me like, what would have happened if you would have published a book sooner? What if this happened? What if that happened? The truth is I'm extremely happy with where my life is right now. And like, I wouldn't want to change one single second of it because, I can almost see it unraveling, almost like I'm plotting out a book. Like, if they had solved this back when I was in kindergarten, maybe my head wouldn't have been buried in books as much as it was, which means I wouldn't have developed a love for reading as much as I did, which means I might not have chased this and I might not be working as an author today. I wouldn't change anything.
That is so awesome. That's so good to hear. As far as before you got diagnosed, what were you thinking was going on with you? And then after you were diagnosed, how did that change your perception?
Well, I always felt I was different, but I think to a large extent everybody does. So I think because of that, I didn't think I was different. I thought, everybody just sort of feels this way. None of us really fit in. We're all trying our hardest to make that happen. Once I was diagnosed, like when I sat down with this woman, like the reason, like she taught anger management classes at night, but her day job was actually working with autistic kids, which is how she recognized these particular traits in me. So she really took it upon herself to help me. And I stuck with her for years. Just little things like, she taught me to make eye contact, which is, it's crazy hard for somebody like me because the funny thing is like when I'm actually making eye contact in a conversation, I can't pay attention to that conversation. My wife actually knows this. So if I'm staring somebody in the eyes while we're talking, in my head, I'm thinking, keep eye contact, keep eye contact, keep eye contact. So I am not hearing any of the words that are being said. So my wife knows if I'm making eye contact with her in a conversation, I'm not really paying attention. She knows me well enough, but like little things like that, like once they were brought to the forefront and I was able to identify them, I was able to create workarounds. And a lot of it is just about fitting in. I may not necessarily be comfortable with what those workarounds are. It's work, but the more I do it, the easier it gets. So we were talking about this before we started. Like the last thing I want to do is get up in front of people and talk. So I force myself to get up in front of people and talk. And the more I do it, the easier it gets. and I could easily retreat. Like if I decided to stop doing that one day, I've already got a career that is literally, me behind a desk, not having to talk to anybody other than the voices in my head. Like it would be very easy for me to retreat into that and be very happy with it, but that's not where I want to be. So I force myself to do the hard things to stay ahead of it.
So let me ask you this. What is it in you that doesn't allow yourself to go to that comfort zone?
I think I see it as a challenge. Like every time, like I'm a millionaire for the third time in my life. The first time I did it in the music business, then I did it again in the financial industry, and now I'm doing it again as an author. And if I lost everything tomorrow and you handed me a banana and said, you need to make a living with this banana, I would be a millionaire again within another year. There's just this drive inside of me that forces me to excel and kind of pull the best out of myself and the people around me, no matter what the circumstances are. And I think, I treated this the same way. Like I could have said, oh, I've got this problem and, woe is me. And, I could have doubled down on it that way if I wanted to, but like that wouldn't have got me where I wanted to be in life. So I looked at, well, what does it allow me to do that nobody else can do? From the writing standpoint, we had talked about, me being able to duplicate other people's voices. Like that was a huge talent that just doesn't exist in this particular industry, and it got me a lot of work. So I doubled down on stuff like that, and I continue to do that today. If I find something that I'm able to do that other people can't, that's a wheelhouse I want to be in.
I wonder what your ADHD and autism what part they may have played in you kind of staying in that background for a minute.
Well, I think staying in the background was more or less me just fulfilling a role. Like I was told, my mom at a very early age told me that writing is a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. And
Wrong,
she
mom.
drilled that into, yeah, she drilled that into my head. So I just assumed that was, your mom tells you that, it's got to be true, right? So, I went off to college, I got multiple degrees and ended up working in finance. But writing was always something that I absolutely loved. So I would come home and I would work on these projects at night. And years ago, one of my first jobs in college, I worked for RCA Records at BMG Distribution down in South Florida. So if they had a recording artist come into town, I'd have to pick them up at the airport, get them to their concert, get them to the radio stations for their interviews, get them to their hotel. If you ever saw that movie, Get Them to the Greek, that was essentially my life back then. And yeah, I was in college, which is expensive. And I quickly realized I've got some very famous people in the car with me, sometimes for a week at a time. So I started to interview them, and I would take those interviews and sell them to magazines like Teen Beat and Tiger Beat and Teen People. And that's essentially how I broke into the writing world, because when you work for a newspaper or magazine, everybody you're working with has a novel at some stage of development in a desk drawer somewhere. It's 400,000 words long. They've been working on it for the last 10 years. It's almost done. Needs a little something. I became one of the guys they would give it to because I recognized those patterns in a book. I could read a manuscript. I could tell you where it goes wrong. I could tell you what needs to come out. I just mentally, I'm comparing it to the bestsellers that I've read, and this is what is different about your book, and this is what you need to change in order to make it one of those bestsellers. So that basically turned into a side hustle as a book doctor. I got hired by agents, by editors to tweak other people's manuscripts, and a lot of times completely rewrite them, sometimes write them from scratch based on their ideas. But I did that while I was working the corporate gig. So for 23 years, over that time, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times bestseller list that basically came out with other people's names on the cover that I had written, which gets old after a while. So when number 6 hit up, my wife pulled me aside and she said, listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's find a way to make it happen. So we came up with this crazy plan, because we were kind of trapped at that point. I had a very strong salary. We had a big house. We had cars. We had a boat. We couldn't just walk away from the lifestyle because the lifestyle was expensive. So we had to finance that. So rather than figuring out how to pay for that lifestyle, we sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side to some tenants, and we moved into the other side and basically lived off of savings long enough for me to write that first book. But it took her, giving me a good kick in the butt to make that happen, because I would have probably stuck with that desk job for the rest of my life.
Well, safe, right?
Yeah, it was safe. Everything was working. I was doing what society expected. I was making a good salary, I had a nice corporate job. We had the house, we had the cars, we had the boat, we had money in the bank, and that's what you're told you're supposed to do. So I felt like I was fulfilling that particular role, but it didn't mean I was happy.
And so when your wife kind of gave you that kick in the butt, was it that same feeling of this is a challenge and I'm going to?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was very scary, to step away from something that I know is working and make that kind of drastic change, because there's no coming back from it. When you tell your boss you're quitting, you can't roll that back. So I knew once we pulled that trigger, I had to go through. I had to follow through with it.
Well, and I have to say, like, for a person with autism, routines and those types of things are pretty important too. You turned your world upside down in a way that, like, for a person with a typical brain would have difficulty with. But somebody with autism, everything was changed. And change is so hard.
I think honestly, if I change little things, I think it's a lot more difficult for me to deal with. Like this was such an incredible wholesale change. Like literally everything changed. And I think because of that, it was actually easier to deal with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because it's kind of still just one change, right?
It was one huge, giant change,
Right.
which is you would think would be harder, but in a lot of ways that made it easier because everything had changed.
Yeah, there was no expectation of normalcy.
Not at all. No, then it all became, like, okay, now how do I become an author? And like that became the goal and the brass ring. And I, knew I was going to have to chase that.
So, when you were a kid and you were getting shuttled around all these other classrooms and such, I'm sure you never thought, I'm going to be a New York Times best-selling author.
Now, and it's funny because like English was always my strong thing. Like I never had to study for it. If a teacher gave me an assignment on it, I knew I was going to get an A. Like I was always just very good at that. But, because of what my mom told me, like it was always the fallback. She even explained it, like writing is, it's one of those things. It doesn't matter what your career is going to be. You're going to have to write. And the fact that you can do it well is just going to be something that's going to help you with that. But it was never the career. She didn't expect that to happen. And it's funny, even today, I mean, I've got 19 books out there. When I call her, she's like, yeah, but that writing thing, how's that going? It's never gonna be her ideal career, but it is definitely mine.
Yeah, I have dabbled in, just like you said, I've got a half-written book in my drawer, but, I tend to be much better at technical writing.
And I was too I mean, like writing that compliance manual, 1,000 some pages of rules and regulations, like here's the rule, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. Like that was, I could do it. It was very formulaic. But to me, any type of nonfiction just feels like work. And fiction to me is just fun.
I feel like technical writing, it lacks urgency, interest, novelty, and all those other things that we
Yeah,
like so much.
not a whole lot of pacing or crazy twists going on in technical writing.
I'm wondering, with your brain, you come up with a lot of really interesting ideas. I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me in the pool the other day after I read your book. I was swimming in the pool along, and all of a sudden I started thinking about, what would be a really great ending for one of his books is this woman is drowning and she's angry because she has to drown herself to save her child. And so the last scene is her screaming all of the air out of her lungs in the water. Then I had like a little hyperventilation going on because I was swimming in the water and I didn't want to drown. And I thought, how does JD come up with these ideas? Because when they come into my head, I find them to be very disturbing.
Well, to me, it's therapeutic to put it down on paper. It's scary and it's in my head. Like it almost feels like it's trapped up there until I put it down on paper. And then it's kind of like I exorcised a demon and I can move on. So that's how I've always dealt with it. Like if you talk to thriller writers or horror writers in general, we're some of the most level-headed people out there. And I think it's because our therapy is the written word, what we're doing every day.
Well, because you come up with some pretty demented stuff. So I would hope that there would have to be some.
Yeah, and I don't know where like 99% of it comes from. Like for me, it's literally like watching a movie play out in my head, and I'm just writing it down as fast as I can. And I've had plenty of books where I'd write a scene, and I push my computer across the desk when I'm done, and like, holy hell, where did that come from? But there is no answer to it. The characters to me are all very real people. They're all very different people, and their opinions aren't necessarily my opinions, which may seem very strange to somebody who's not an author, but that's the way it is for me.
And that makes perfect sense to me because I find that as you're reading a book, if you're reading the book as if you're reading characters, it's harder to keep track of it than if these are people that you're meeting, right?
Mhm.
So, like for me, I met Billy at the beginning of your story. I got to know Billy, and then I got to, know Maddie, and so it's different because you can remember a real person better than a character, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I've studied it. Stephen King's one of my all-time favorite writers.
Me too.
I read everything that he writes, and then I'll go back through with a highlighter as an author and go, well, how did he do this? How did he do that? And he is fantastic at creating people in like 2 or 3 sentences. His short stories in particular are a great teaching tool if you ever want to learn that particular skill set. But yeah, I've studied it, so I've tried to implement it. But, again, like before I sit down to write a book like the one you just read, like I know those people inside and out. The author, I think, really should. Like if you sit down, 3 of your characters, put them in front of you and ask them all the same question, you should get 3 different answers, just like you would if you sat 3 real people in front of you. If you don't, then you need to further develop your characters because they're not quite there yet.
And it's so interesting to me because as a person with autism, social cues and personalities, those types of things tend to be a struggle for a lot of people with ADHD and autism. And you tend to have that as a strength rather than as a struggle.
Well, I think once you understand it, just like anything else, then you can turn it into a positive. I mean, it's either going to be an anchor that's weighing you down, or it could be something that you can use to get ahead. And I choose to get ahead.
Now, I know you are a huge advocate for autism and you like to get your message out about it. I always like to give my guests the last main word. And so if you were able to advocate or say what you wanted to say about autism to the world, what would it be?
We're in a very different world than we were when I was younger, when I first started dealing with this. Now we've got the internet. There's tons of material out there. Now even AI can help you walk through some of these particular problems. But I meet with parents on a regular basis that have autistic children. And they might have like an 18-month-old kid who's literally sitting on the floor, beating its head against the wall and just screaming. And they can't touch the child because that just makes things worse. And they're like, this is our life. They're freaking out because they don't understand where this is all going to go. That was me when I was a kid at 18 months old. So I tell parents that, and this is where I am now is where their child could be later. But you have to, take a step back, understand what is going on. A lot of times, once you do that, if you start to recognize little pieces, sit down with the right people, they can find that trigger that's causing it, and you can roll these things back and you can start to unravel it. For a lot of the children that I talk to, a lot of times it's just about finding the one thing that they really like. They're totally quiet. They won't talk to anybody, but you find that one thing that they like and they will rattle on and on and on and on. You need to do that. So there's so many little things like that, but there is hope at the end of that tunnel. And a lot of it could be prosperous if you focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would go one step further and say it's always really important to have a person who gets it, who understands it. For you, your therapist probably was very important because it was a person
Yeah.
who gets it. It could be your mother, it could be your teacher, it could be whoever, but being able to have one person who understands you as a person, I think is really important.
Yeah. We're lucky enough to live in a world where those people are out there now, and they're getting a lot easier to find.
Who was your person?
Well, I think initially it was that therapist, but in today's world, it's most definitely my wife, because like when we first met, we had the conversation about autism very early on, because I could pretend to be like the perfect guy on a date, but like you can't keep that up. At some point, the mask comes off and the autistic person is standing there. So we had that conversation at the very beginning. We, sought out and got a therapist before we, really started seriously dating, before we got married. Just to learn how to communicate with each other, because, the way that we communicate is very different, I think, than a normal couple would be. And we've, over the years, we brought therapists back in when we needed them and brought them, got rid of them when we don't. But I think it's good to be open-minded about that sort of thing.
Wow, what an absolute dedication to your love for each other to be willing to bring in a therapist and do the work that needs to be done. Well, I want to say thank you so much, JD, for being on my show today. I have really, really appreciated hearing everything about you and your ADHD, your autism, your writing, your life, your family, just everything. And if our butterflies on the wall are listening in, if they would subscribe and like and do all those things right now. And thank you so much, JD.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you.